So I'm going to do something pretty daring or stupid, depending on your perspective, perhaps, and share some of my thoughts about a topic which it seems very hard to have civil and nuanced conversations about. And that is the topic of the Middle East, in particular, the situation between Israel and Palestine. And not just between Israel and Palestine, but between Israel and the larger Arab world. Um, and I want to make clear from the outset here that I am by no means the most educated person about this. I consider myself to be a relatively well-educated and informed person, and someone who was plugged into international politics and paid attention to it and learned a fair amount about it over many decades, and learned something about the conflicts in the Middle East during some of that time decades ago. But I also plainly admit, as I've been talking about in a lot of other videos, I've been going through my own personal horror story that has ended up taking up a lot of my time and life energy over most of the last decade. And as part of the result of that, I have not had nearly as much bandwidth to pay attention to the stories that are happening in the news and the rest of the world a lot of the time. And I certainly am much less up to date on a lot of that news than I might have been a decade ago. But I also think I'm not alone there. I think there are so many of us who, ever since 2016 or 2020, where we want to start that clock, just as this world has gotten more and more loony, have felt a need to unplug from the news and the stress of the world and just live in our own bubbles and all that and take care of ourselves. So I thought about, prior to this video, actually doing more research and trying to present a really sort of comprehensive and informed point of view based on a bunch of details about this story to educate people. But I decided against that. I decided the better thing to do was just to sort of admit my current state of ignorance and talk about things as I see them. So I very much want to say that maybe one thing that makes this different than a lot of my other videos is that I'm talking about something that I know I'm underinformed about, and that it's quite possible other people who are watching this are better informed than I am. And I do welcome conversation or correction or pointing to resources that can help better educate me about this topic. And I welcome new insight and I welcome civil conversation in the comments. But I do have some concern that this is such a polarizing topic that it is likely that if people start commenting on this in any way, shape, or form, that the comments may go off the rails and become very uncivil. So all I'm going to say is, if you are going to comment in the comments, keep it civil, and if things become too uncivil, I may just turn commenting off and not allow it for this particular video. But I do want to try to, as I said, talk about all of this with some nuance and not in a way that is really like pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian or anything like that, but just talk about things how I understand them. At the same time, I want to admit I have my own biases, my own background that I come from, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the beginning too, just so you get some understanding of who you're hearing this from, who's talking about this, and whether or not it's someone you believe you should listen to and all that. So for full transparency, I will admit I am from New York City, which of course is one of the cities in the world with one of the largest Jewish populations in the world, and I am ethnically half Jewish. I actually come from German ancestry on both sides of my family. My mother's maiden name and my father's last name are both German surnames. But my mother's side of the family is entirely Jewish and my father's side is not. At the same time, I did not grow up religiously Jewish. I feel like my own direct family, I come from sort of a long line of secular Jews, and even for the few generations before my mother, most of the people in the family were not practicing Jews. There are a few exceptions of people who married into families that were a little more practicing, nothing very orthodox, but that did maybe practice the religion a bit more than we did. But like me growing up, I didn't really celebrate things like Passover, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Hanukkah at all. I was never bar mitzvahed. I actually was baptized, but I don't really consider myself Christian either. I kind of grew up observing religion a little bit from afar more than actually participating in it. But I definitely feel like there were some people in my family who, even if they weren't religious, had a sense of Jewish identity. And I grew up around a lot of Jewish people, and I have some sense of what that Jewish identity means beyond just practicing the religion. And I remember in particular my great grandmother, who passed away at 100 years old, actually, and I remember very fondly, said to me many times when I was young and I was a good student and a smart guy that I had a Jewish mind. Even though she was not preaching the religion to me, she saw my intellect and my capacity and tendency towards scholarship as being a Jewish characteristic. And she's not the only person I heard that thing from. I think it's part of the Jewish religion is that it is a sort of skeptical religion that values scholarship and academics a lot. At the same time, I also want to say, like, I am not anti-Arab. And I have a lot of relationships with people from the Middle East who have Arabic backgrounds. And I want to be clear that it's a weird, interesting quirk of my family that somehow my immediate family, almost all of my siblings and I, have actually had a number of romantic relationships with people who have Middle Eastern backgrounds. I have 3 sisters. One of them is married to an Israeli man who was an Israeli citizen before he came over here and married her. But another one of my sisters is married to a man of Ashkenazi Jewish background from Los Angeles. And my other sister is actually married to a person who is a Syrian background and Christian. That's one thing, Eastern Orthodox Christian. And my sister actually attends an Eastern Orthodox church, or Syrian Orthodox. So I have connections to people with Christian backgrounds from the Middle East as well. And although no one in my family is directly married to a Muslim, I will say that I previously had a, not really a romantic relationship, but quasi-romantic relationship, you might say. I have a good friend, or a person who I haven't seen in a while, but was a very good friend for a long time, who is from Dubai, is from the United Arab Emirates, and is actually like a green card holder, might even be a U.S. citizen by now, but still on the path to becoming a U.S. citizen. But at one point we were sort of romantically interested in each other, and she actually asked me if I would consider converting to Islam so that we could date. And she didn't think it had to necessarily be an entirely serious thing. It might have just been going through the motions to please her family, but it was still not something I was willing to do, and that's kind of put the kibosh on us ever really dating. But my point in all this is that I do have some skin in the game in terms of having a lot of personal connections to people from the Middle East, of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim backgrounds, in addition to many other friends, many other acquaintances of all these backgrounds. And also I spent the first 4 years of my life in the New York City and Washington, D.C. areas, which are of course very international cities. So I've met many people of all of these religious backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds. So I like to think that my opinions on all of this, not to say they're the most well-informed, but they are informed by like dealing with real people face to face of all of these different backgrounds, some of whom who lived in that area. I myself have not traveled to the Middle East, although I have family members who have. But I'm not coming at it from a place of complete ignorance or where this is just a hypothetical, abstract game to me. I know this is a real place with real people's lives. And as I said, I was, even in my days in high school and younger, I was aware of a lot of what was happening with Israel and the Arab world in the Middle East to some degree. And I do think that's a really important part of all this, because I absolutely do not want to diminish the importance of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It absolutely is important, and it is something that we need to focus on. But I also think that it needs to be looked at through the lens of the larger relationship between Israel and the Arab Middle East as a whole. And I think that you're not going to really understand the position of Israel and why a lot of Israelis and their governments have the attitudes they do and behave the way they do by just looking at Israel's relationship with Palestine. You need to look at their relationship with the rest of the Arab world as well. And a big part of this, of course, is that Israel was formed in the aftermath of World War II and the Jewish Holocaust. And it was the case that the land there actually used to be called British Palestine. It was at one point essentially a colonial territory of the UK. And the Brits actually handed it over to Israel and allowed it to become a state and give Israelis a refuge when there was no real country of Israel at that time, and a huge number of Israelis had been displaced, didn't have a real home or homeland because of World War II and the Holocaust. And that's where the word Zionism comes in a lot. People talk about Zionism. So Zionism was a political movement in the early 20th century about forming this Jewish state, and that eventually resulted in the forming of the state of Israel. And one thing I think is sort of unfortunate is that these days there are so many politically charged arguments where people really bend language to mean different things that it meant in the past and to just mean particular things emotionally to other people. And as far as I'm concerned, there really are no Zionists and anti-Zionists these days. That's about a particular political issue and political movement from many, many decades ago, from the last century. The fact is that in the time before and when Israel got formed as a state, you could have made political arguments for the formation of Israel as a state or the arguments against the formation of Israel as a state. And I think there should be room for political debate on both of those sides. But I also want to be clear that that is a decision that was already made. The state of Israel already exists. It has been an independent country for a long, long time, and there are millions of people who live there. And anyone who says they're anti-Zionist now, what you're opposing the formation of Israel as a state, too late. It already happened. I think what people often mean by this is really a certain amount of hatred of Israel and the Israeli state, and feeling like it never should have been formed, and therefore we have the right to uproot this entire country, to get rid of it, to push these people out of this land. And that is, by its nature, a violent position, right? That is something you're not going to easily get rid of a country like that with this many people that's already been settled this long without violence happening. There's no simple way to displace Israel or anything like that. And I get that some people think that violence might be motivated because they feel that Israel themselves are the perpetrators of violence and that Palestine's homeland was taken away. And I'm not saying that because something is violent, it is necessarily wrong. There are times when violence is warranted and needed. And I'm trying to be more pragmatic than idealistic here in terms of what the actual situation is. But I want people to really understand what you're advocating for if you're saying you're anti-Zionist in 2026. You're advocating for the destruction of an existing state. And at the same time, I don't think that people who are pro-Israel now and want Israel to continue to exist as a country should be labeled as Zionists. Some of them might willfully take that term, others might not. But the position of Israel is already a state in 2026 and it exists and it should continue to exist is a different position than going back to the last century, Israel should be formed as a new political state. And I think that's a very important nuance to pay attention to here, is that you might have thought that the wrong thing was done by Israel being formed historically, and still have a feeling, well, now it's here. We have to deal with the reality that's here and the different political landscape that entails. At the same time, I also want to be clear here. As I said, I try not to come at this from an anti-Arab perspective, and I do have a lot of respect for a lot of other Arab countries and their cultures in a lot of ways, but I do think it is a very fair criticism to make of a lot of the Arab Middle East that many of these countries and many people who are Arab Middle Easterners have a lot of antipathy toward Israel. There is a great amount of hatred of Israel, some of which is more on the surface, some of which is more under the surface. And there are many people in these countries who would like to see Israel get removed and would like to take over that land and drive the country out of existence. And I'm not just talking about Hamas here. And I am not saying that this is what all Arab and Muslim Middle Easterners want at all either. I think it's also very, very important to understand that there are leaders of countries who have the political power, who have the guns, who have the weapons, and there are tons of us who are subject to their whims, subject to their motivations, subject to their wars. And there are many people in the world who are much more apolitical, just living their lives, want peace and happiness and prosperity for themselves or others, want to be able to do their jobs and live in a peaceful place. And I think that goes for Jews, that goes for Muslims, that goes for Christians, that goes for people who are none of those religions in the Middle East, as well as everywhere else around the world. So the people are not their governments. And we shouldn't assume that everyone who is part of these countries has the same view as their governments and has the same biases and the same sort of desire to inflict pain or help or hurt different groups of people. At the same time, we can also say that there certainly are some people who have views that are in line with what some of their government leaders say, and there also is a lot of propaganda out there. There's a lot of information and news and stuff that's designed to get in people's heads ideas that support a particular government or to oppose a particular government. And a lot of people have very strong feelings on this stuff one way or another in terms of whether they're pro-Israel or anti-Israel, pro-Palestine, anti-Palestine, or something else entirely. But the point here is that the views of the individuals, they don't have any real power unless they happen to be in the government, right? It is the people who have the government influence, the government power, are the ones who actually decide where the bombs and guns and all those things are pointed. And I want to say here that there's a huge amount of disinformation out there. There's a huge amount of misinformation. There's a huge amount of people who have strong opinions about this one way or another that might be shaped by other people trying to manipulate them or touch certain nerve centers and all that. At the same time, especially for people who live in the Middle East, there are a huge number of people who have strong feelings about this that are actually informed by experience. They're actually informed by living there or having family who lives there and sees how their lives have been affected and all of that. And I think that's something that you really should be careful about considering the difference between. Is that whatever your opinions on the Middle East and the political situation and the different countries and players in that are, I think is important to ask yourself is, are my opinions coming from a place that is informed by people who actually live there, see life on the ground? Do I have things that directly impact me or my family members or friends involved in this? Or am I really a spectator looking at this from afar, building my opinions on what I think I know about the region from what other people have told me? And I think that regardless of who you are and who you believe or like or dislike, if you're not from that region and you're only hearing this from afar, I think you should give some respect to the people whose lives this actually touches in a more direct way. You should realize that they are coming from a place of, this is our lives, this is our safety, this is our land, and whether you think it should be our land or not. And this is what's happening to us. This isn't just an abstract game for us. I think that's a really important perspective to keep alive. And I think it's also, honestly, a position that a lot of Arabs and Muslims from the Middle East might not be happy to have voiced publicly, but I think there's some truth to it, that there is enough negative sentiment toward Israel. And I'm not just talking about now. I'm talking about over the last many decades, ever since Israel was formed in the mid-20th century, that and enough leaders in a lot of these Arab countries that there's a good chance that Israel would have already been invaded and wiped off the face of the planet, if not for the fact that the U.S. has been a very strong ally of Israel for a long time, given them lots of guns and weapons, helped arm them, made them one of the stronger militaries in the world. Now, you can argue whether or not the U.S. was doing the right thing in providing military support to Israel and whether the U.S. should change its policies based on Israel's more recent actions. And I think you're absolutely entitled to have whatever position you want on those arguments. But I think it's also important to look at that from the context of, if the U.S. had not spent decades arming Israel, there probably would be no Israel today. And there would have been a great amount of the Arab world that was culpable for actually attacking the country and wiping it out, which you might label genocide. And I'm using the word genocide here. It's a big word, it's a scary word. And it is a word I think that has been bandied about in ways that are very much about creating inflammatory rhetoric and getting people to hate other people and touch their emotions. And genocide is real. Genocide has happened a number of times in our history, and one of the most notable times is the genocide that happened to the Jews during World War II. Now, the question of whether you want to label what is happening to Palestinians right now a genocide is, I think, a very loaded question for a lot of people. And I'm not telling you an answer one way or another. I'm not saying I know enough to be able to make a decision on that. But I do think that there are a lot of people who, in their minds, have already made up their mind on that issue. Either, yes, this is a genocide, or no, this is not a genocide, and I feel that strongly to my core. And if you disagree with me, we cannot have a civil argument or discussion. We do not have any common ground. And I just want to be clear about that, is that it is very much, I think, the intention of a lot of people who bring words like that into the rhetoric, into the debate, to try to shut down dialogue, to try to get people at each other's throats, and to stop any common ground from being seen, and to stop people from really looking at the nuance of what is happening here. So I often worry when I hear people, like the first thing they say about the Israeli conflict being that they're anti-genocide, or that just labeling it in that very simplistic way, that you have to be on this side, otherwise you're supporting genocide. Because I think that is an argument that is designed to shut down thought. It is designed to shut down analysis, designed to shut down looking at the situation and the true horrors of it. And it is truly horrifying. And it has been truly horrifying for many decades, not just in the current war. So let's be clear about that. There is a long history of violence between Israel and Palestine over a long period of time. There have been attempts to broker peace many, many times that have failed. There was at one point a long time ago a talk about a one-state solution, which seemed to have fallen apart and been something that the Palestinians were completely opposed to. And a two-state solution seems to be the only viable solution these days, if it is even viable. And viable, I'm using the word very loosely here, because a lot of what we're seeing and have seen in the Middle East for a long time is very far from viable in the long term. But the point is that there is a nation of Israel, and there is a land of Palestine that is partially controlled by Israel right now and partially not. And that's part of it. Is Palestine is really two separate areas. It's the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And the only place that actually has de facto independence is Gaza Strip. And Palestine claims the West Bank as part of their country too, but it is Israel-occupied land. It is, according to Israel, part of their country as much as it is, according to Palestine, part of their country. And it is something where de facto Israel has a lot more control of it. And there's a long history with this. There's a long history with there being a lot of Israeli settlements in that Palestinian territory. And I've seen maps over the years where there were, like dots and shaded areas of how much of that land was actually Palestinian, how much of it became Israeli settlements in there, and it became more and more like Swiss cheese. And I know I was paying attention back when Obama was president, and obviously this goes long back before Obama was president too, but even during Obama's presidency, he was very critical of Netanyahu for allowing so many Israeli settlements to develop in the West Bank and not and infringing on what should have been more Palestinian space, more Palestinian land, in his opinion. So I'm not saying you have to agree with Obama on that, have the same position or not, but the point is that the issue of Israel and Palestine fighting over this land goes back a long time, and there are people such as President Obama himself who've made the case that Netanyahu was making that situation worse, was escalating that situation and trying to engineer more and more of an Israeli takeover of that particular land. That is a position that is a respectable political position, in my opinion. Whatever your position on the West Bank is, whether it should be part of Israel or it should be part of Palestine or it should be shared land or whatever, I welcome different opinions about the matter, but I also think that you need to look at this not just from the point of view of what your abstract opinion of it is, but what the truth is on the ground, what is actually happening there and has happened over there over many decades. And it is also the truth that there have been many attempts to make peace, many ceasefires that have lasted sometimes for years, and that those have been broken. And if you hear people on the Israeli side talk about it, a lot of them will say that we have never violated the ceasefires. It is only the Palestinians that have violated the ceasefires over and over again and restarted a war and attacked us and provoked us into attacking them back. And I do think that the people on the Israeli side who say that have a good point. There's a lot of truth in what they say. At the same time, there are a lot of people on the Palestinian side who might make arguments that Israel has not really given us room to live. They've cut off our access to resources, and there was no way that we actually could function as an independent country and get our basic needs met and get our people fed. And the ways in which Israel has isolated and deprived us and put us at a disadvantage has caused us to have to attack them in order to provide for the safety of our own country. Now, I will say very much that I do believe that there are Palestinians and pro-Palestinian people who believe that. Do I believe that? I don't know. I will tell you the truth is that I feel like I recognize there are limitations to my knowledge. There are ways in which I feel unequipped to say whether Palestine was justified in violating some of the ceasefires that they did. And I'm not just talking about one ceasefire here. I'm talking about many others over time. So I'm not looking at this from the point of view of good guys and bad guys solely. I'm looking at this from the point of view of a very complicated, messy dynamic between these two countries where both of their survivals and thriving affect each other. The fact is that whether it's one state or two, there's no denying that their lives and the existence of their countries and the existence of their people affect each other in some way. There is an interaction that happens no matter what. And I do think that it is the case that there are a number of other Middle Eastern countries, a number of Arabic countries that have provided arms to the Palestinians during a lot of this time. And of course, as we already talked about, the primary country that's provided arms to Israel is the US. So there are outside forces, there are other countries that have provided arms to these people, which have enabled them to carry on warfare with each other. That is absolutely true. But I also think it's part of why you need to look at this through the context of the larger Israeli-Arab situation in the Middle East. Given that there are a number of other Arab countries where the anti-Israeli sentiment is strong, and there are a number of political leaders and other people in those countries who might like to wipe Israel out or cause them great damage or weaken their country in some way, there are a number of people politically who have been incentivized to destabilize that region, who are actually quite happy to arm the Palestinians and foment war there not because they care about the advantage of Palestinians, not because they care about Palestinians having good lives, but simply because they want chaos in the region, they want more people to die, they want to hurt Israel. I think that is a very, very important thing to understand about the region. And again, I'm not saying people are monoliths, people in their countries or any specific country or anything like that. I'm saying that these forces exist in the Arab Middle East. I'm not saying they're the only forces in the Middle East at all. But I think that they need to be acknowledged, they need to be seen, and to understand why a lot of people have the motivations they do. Now, I feel like most of what I've said, even though it might touch some hot buttons for some people and get you to want to argue with me, is really pretty indisputable so far. It's just sort of the lay of the land of what historically has happened and what the situation is here. Now I'm going to say something which is maybe a little bit less of a popular point of view, and which other people might feel I am misinformed or uninformed on. And if I am, I welcome being corrected on this, and I welcome you telling me that you disagree with me and providing me resources to point me in another direction. But I think this is an important thing from my understanding of things, which may or may not be correct. As far as I know, a lot of people, I think in their heads, make a distinction between the Hamas, the terrorist organization that wants to wipe Israel off the face of the planet, and the government of Palestine. And as far as I understand, there is no real distinction there. Hamas essentially is the government of Palestine. It is one party that controls all the political power there and basically sets the agenda for the country as a whole. And it is part of its rhetoric, part of its mission to wipe out the Israeli state. And it is classified by much of the world as a terrorist organization. Now, I think terrorism is another word like genocide that immediately raises people's hackles and gets them angry and gets them feeling alarmed and sort of shuts down debate and thought and rational analysis. And I will tell you, I am not nearly as triggered by the word terrorist as a lot of people are, and I don't mean it entirely as an epithet here. I want to be very careful about that. If anything, my own story, the things that I've been dealing with for the last several years and the ways that I've had to fight against injustice have actually given me a lot more sympathy for terrorists of all different stripes. I want to be clear that people get to a point of having to resort to terrorism or believing that they have to resort to terrorism because they don't see a way of actually getting their needs met, of surviving and thriving and living an ordinary life. And again, I'm not saying this is true of all Palestinians or all Arab terrorists in the Middle East or anything like that, but I can definitely say that like part of the reason that terrorism has become a problem there and continues to be a problem is that people have been convinced, whether the convincing is true or not, whether they're seeing the world accurately or not, that they don't have a better path, they don't have a better choice in terms of actually living a life and having to resort to these things. Furthermore, I think that terrorism is a word that is used generally only when the violence that has happened is not state supported. And depending on whether you see the state as legitimate or not, you might be more or less willing to use a term like terrorism. And people who say that Palestine is a terrorist state don't see the legitimacy of it as a state. If you see it as a legitimate state, you might be less inclined to label its military action terrorist. But I'm going to say the same is true about Israel here too. I think that it is fair game, in my opinion, to say that some of the political actions of Netanyahu and of Israel might be labeled as terroristic if they didn't have a state supporting them. I don't think Netanyahu is any kind of angel or anything like that. And I think there are a lot of ways, as I said before, even in his conflicts with Obama and in his handling of recent events, that you can make the case that Netanyahu has escalated things, has made things worse. But what I really want to say here, and I'm saying this not to be anti-Israeli or anti-Palestinian at all, is that if you really look at the history of it, both the people of Israel and the people of Palestine have had their safety under threat for many decades, have not had a safe home, have had neighbors who've hated them and threatened them and made it difficult for them to live their lives and live their dreams and just have a peaceful existence and coexistence with others around them. And those are the kind of conditions where people are going to more likely want to have terroristic leaders and to support terroristic leaders. So even though I can say that I plainly do not like Hamas and do not want them running Palestine, and I do not like Netanyahu and do not want him running Israel, I can also fully understand from the point of view of people who have been living in these places under the last many decades of history and what they've had to go through, what their point of view has been, what their experience has been, why they feel more and more desperate, and why they tend to feel emotionally like they want very strong military leaders who are going to fight hard against this other country that is threatening their livelihood and their life so much. And I don't blame Israelis for hating Palestinians, and I don't blame Palestinians for hating Israelis. I think it's a very natural thing that is likely to happen if people have grown up in this circumstance for many decades. And this is the sad reality of this whole thing to me. To me, it's not about just good guys and bad guys here. It's about the fact that if there isn't a solution that provides for a peaceful way forward with a chance for prosperity, a chance for a good life, both for all Israelis and for all Palestinians, the terrorism in that region is never going to end. That's the really important thing to understand, is that it has been such a bad place for such a long time with so much violence, with so much inability to build a good society that takes care of everybody there, and so much distrust between people, that to a certain extent it seems to me that these countries just can't be trusted to ever work things out and can't be expected to ever work things out, given all the bad blood that has happened to them and in between them. And sometimes I think we actually need a stronger outside force to kind of say, okay, you children can't play anymore. We have to take away all your guns. We have to, make sure that an outside force comes in here and actually enforces a peace and enforces a peaceful separation and ends up, making sure that both Palestinians and Israelis can live in a peaceful way. But keep in mind that if you're taking that point of view, what the point of view you're taking of is a military takeover of Israel, right? The fact is that we have a pretty strong idea in the world that countries have their own sovereignty. And whether or not they run the show very well, they are entitled to control over their own borders, and you can't come in and run the show with them or for them in their place without, a hostile takeover, without declaring war. And this is the fact, is that I'm not saying that taking over Israel and Palestine and a third party coming in is the right solution. I'm just saying that I totally understand how hopeless it looks based on decades of Israel and Palestine not being able to work their issues out, that might seem to be the only practical solution. And what that practical solution would entail is going to war with those countries, taking them over by force. So in a way, I feel like we're in a really bad situation where there are no good solutions. And that's where we've been for a long, long, long time here. None of that should distract from the fact that the current war started from the October 7th attacks by Palestine on Israel. And that these were absolutely heinous attacks on the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur. And that Palestine is the one who really broke that most recent ceasefire and started this war. And again, I'm not saying Palestine is entirely the bad guys for this. I'm saying you have to take into full context all of the history that happened in the many decades before this. But it is natural to expect that when one country attacks another country, there is going to be a military reprisal. The other country is going to attack them back. And this is part of what happens, is that these political leaders on all sides get in their arguments, get their fights to happen, and the ordinary peoples of both of these countries end up suffering as a result. The ordinary peoples end up dying and suffering a huge amount of violence because their political leaders can't work shit out. And there are tons of people, both on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, who might not want war, who have no choice but to live in a war zone, who are getting bombed, who are, in danger, who are losing lives, and all of that kind of thing. It also seems to me, and again, I'm happy to be corrected if somebody can tell me otherwise here, that Palestine took a whole lot of hostages from Israel on their October 7th invasion, and they spent a long, long time intentionally not returning those hostages because they wanted to prolong the war. Because the Palestinian leaders didn't really value the lives of their people and were happy to incite Israel to keep attacking them and killing more of their people so that they could play this perception game with the rest of the world and make Israel look like the bad guys. They could incite Israel and then paint it a particular way in social media and in the news and the world and all that. And I do think there's a case to be made that Palestine has not only wronged Israel, the Palestinian government has wronged Israel not only by attacking it and taking hostages and taking lives, but has wronged its own people by not doing what is best for peace for its own people. And I also think that a lot of the rest of the Arab Middle East, as I've talked about before, is guilty of doing things to destabilize the region. So I think it's actually a very reasonable point of view to say that ordinary Palestinian people who might not want war are actually victims of Israel for directly causing them military harm, but also of their own government for doing things to incite Israel and to cause war in the region, and the Arab governments around the rest of the Middle East who have also done things to incite war in the region. And quite simply, in some ways, I think Palestine is often treated as sort of the ugly stepchild of the Arab Middle East. There's a lot of other Arab Middle Eastern countries and people who I think don't actually care about or like Palestine or Palestinians all that much, and don't really want them all that much as part of the Arab Middle East, and are just happy to let them be shit on and never taken care of, and only going to act as if they're allies or in support of them if, in so doing, they can hurt Israel. And at the same time, as I am saying this, I do believe that the Palestinians are truly victims in this whole situation. I do believe that a lot of ordinary Israeli people are also victims, and have been victims for a long, long time, of tons of violence perpetrated by Palestine, perpetrated by other Arabs in the Middle East. And the fact is that the area has been a war zone for decades. The area has been so hard to create any kind of peace there. And anyone I feel like who studies the history and learns all of it just becomes so hopeless sometimes that things will ever be fixed between these things, that it may just eternally be a war zone. And that is the horrifying and scary and sad reality for a lot of people. So I think if there's any lesson to be learned from this, I don't have a whole lot of optimism that we're going to get to a better place, but is that if we ever get to a better place, it is only by finding a solution that actually respects the lives of everybody, of Israelis and Palestinians, and builds a safe world for all of them. And by a safe world, I don't just mean a sovereign country existing. I mean a place where they have a route to prosperity, they have a route to make money, to live good lives, to get all their basic needs met. And I do think that there is a big issue with recognizing a state of Palestine, which essentially has a terrorist organization as its government. I don't think it's entirely wrong to label Palestine as a terrorist state. And labeling it as such is not a condemnation of all Palestinians. It is not saying that they deserve anything less, that they should be wiped off the planet, or they're bad people, or anything like that. It is saying that because of history, because of the political situation, because of where they are, they've gotten into a situation where their government and a terrorist organization are basically one and the same. So that is a lot of my feelings on the subject. I feel like I'm able to talk about this stuff rationally and don't feel like I'm trying to inflict hatred on anyone here, but I understand that you might virulently disagree and take my words as hateful, and I just want to do my best to assure you that they are not meant that way, and that if I have said anything incorrect and you think I have any you have any new perspective to offer me or good resources to point me to, then please do so in the comments. But I also want to be clear, like, please take the sources you're getting your information from skeptically. Be really careful about that, because there is a ton of disinformation about this, and I think it is also very much the case that there are a lot of political forces in the world that want to misinform you, whether you're in the Middle East or not. And that's one thing, is that so much of the Democratic Party in the U.S. and the left wing in the U.S. in general has become extremely divided over Israeli-Palestinian issues. And I think there are a lot of operatives on the right among conservative America, and this is probably not just true of conservative America, it's true of other conservative movements in other countries too, but I see it a lot in conservative America, who want to drive that wedge through the middle of liberal America, who want to actually get people having unhealthy debate and just being mad as hell at each other and not understanding the situation in a rational way and just hating each other in order to divide the Democrats and create less support for their political candidates in order to give the Republicans an advantage. Because it is the case that, not to say there's no divisiveness on the Republican side either, but there has generally been a more consistent pro-Israeli and anti-Palestinian attitude among Republican politicians these days. And this is a relatively recent political phenomenon. We should be careful about that. Things are not always that simple in terms of the history of U.S.-Israeli relationships and how different politicians from different political parties have favored or disfavored Israel. In fact, I will tell you a little more about that. I do think it's a fair thing to say that in the time when I was growing up in the late 20th century, looking at the 80s and 90s and whatnot, it is a fair criticism to say that a lot of U.S. policy and U.S. views of the world in the Middle East was biased maybe a little too heavily in Israel's favor and against Palestinians in a way that it wasn't really getting a totally true picture of things and a picture of things that did have some bias to it. But I do think that part of what has happened is, at least for a significant segment of liberals in the Democratic Party, the balance has shifted the other way. And there are many people in the U.S. now who seem to have a very strong anti-Israeli view or anti-Jewish view or anti-Semitic view that is scary to me. And I say this as a person who grew up in the New York area around a large Jewish population, but has lived for the last several decades outside of New York in places where the Jewish population is a lot smaller. And I see that there are a lot of ways in which many Americans don't really know that many Jews. And this is sort of more of an abstract thing to them. And they have bought a lot of that political rhetoric about how much the Jews are the bad guys and how much Israel are the bad guys, hook, line, and sinker, without really looking with any subtlety and nuance at this situation. And there's a lot of palpable anti-Semitic hatred, not just in the U.S., other countries too. My friends in the U.K. have talked about violence against Jews in the U.K. So I think this is a really important thing. Again, the people are not their governments, and especially in the case of people who are Jews in other places, they are not even Israelis necessarily. At the same time, I've also known Palestinian refugees and immigrants and stuff like that, people of Palestinian backgrounds who've lived here in the U.S. or in other places and all that. And you know, they're smaller in number than the number of Jews living outside of the Middle East. There's still some of them as well, and the same things can be said about them. I think that you have to consider that all of these people are not monoliths. They are not necessarily in agreement with everything their governments do. But they have the perspective that they may have family backgrounds there. This may touch them personally, and that their interest in it may not just be as an abstract game. So I feel like be careful how much you believe, and be aware that if you're seeing really inflammatory rhetoric that is anti-Israeli or anti-Palestinian, it could be coming from a number of different sources, right? There are people on the far left who want to put harsh anti-Israeli rhetoric out there, or pro-Palestinian rhetoric, to harm people who are more center-left, who are not as anti-Israel as they are. There are also people on the right who want to put that out there just to get people at the left clawing at each other and hating each other. And often you don't even know where that information is coming from and what the people's real motivation is. And there are so many ways in this political issue and so many others that other people just want to get you at each other's throats, not actually looking at the real situation and just hating each other and shutting down your reasoning faculty and getting you to live entirely in this realm of emotion. So be careful about that. And I hope you found some good food for thought in this.